I spent 34 years as a social worker in Hamilton, Ontario, and the one thing that job taught me, the thing that never left me, even after I retired, was how to stay calm when everything around you is falling apart. I never thought I would need that skill for my own daughter. My daughter had always been the kind of person who filled a room without trying. She studied environmental science at McMaster, volunteered at the food bank every other Saturday, made her own sourdough before it was fashionable. She laughed loud. She had opinions. She would argue with me about composting and transit policy and which Tim Hortons location was worth the drive, and I loved every second of it. So when she called me on a Thursday evening in early March, the kind of cold that still bites in Hamilton even when the calendar pretends it's almost spring, and told me she had met someone, I heard something in her voice I had not heard in years. She sounded light, genuinely light. His name was Colin. He worked in commercial real estate downtown, she said. He had grown up in Oakville, gone to Western, coached youth hockey on weekends. She told me he had walked into the community event where she was presenting her wetland restoration project, and instead of glancing at the display boards and moving on like everyone else, he had stood there for 20 minutes asking her questions. Real questions, she said. He actually listened. I asked her to bring him to Sunday dinner. He came the following weekend with a bottle of Ontario Pinot Noir and a sincerity that I will admit disarmed me. He pulled out my daughter's chair before she could reach it herself. He helped clear the plates without being asked. He asked me about my career in social work and leaned forward when I answered. When I mentioned a particular case, nothing specific, just the general weight of the work, he said quietly that he had enormous respect for people who chose that kind of service. Not in a performative way, in the way of someone who means it. I drove home that night thinking that my daughter had found something good. The first time I noticed something was a Sunday about 4 months after they moved in together. She called to cancel our weekly lunch. She said Colin had planned something for the two of them, a day trip to Niagara-on-the-Lake, and she hadn't wanted to disappoint him. That was the word she used, disappoint. I told her, of course, go have a beautiful day. And I meant it. But I sat with the word for a while after we hung up. The second time was harder to name. We met for coffee in late September at the cafe near her apartment on James Street, the one she had loved since university. She arrived 10 minutes late, which was unlike her. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse I had never seen, very neat, very pressed. Her hair was down, which she almost never wore at that time of day. She ordered a herbal tea instead of the dark roast she had been drinking since she was 19. I asked if she was feeling all right. She said she was fine. She had just been trying to take better care of herself. I said that was good, but over the next hour I noticed that she paused before answering questions. Not long pauses, just a half-second more than usual, as if she were choosing her words with more care than the conversation required. When I asked how work was going, she said it was fine, and then looked briefly at her phone before elaborating. When I asked about their plans for Thanksgiving, she said she thought they might go to Colin's mother's place in Oakville, and then added, quickly, that she was looking forward to it. I drove home thinking about the blouse, about the tea, about the pause. I told myself she was just settling into a relationship, that people adjust, that compromise is natural and healthy, and I had no reason to read anything into a herbal tea. I told myself that for 7 months. Colin's mother, I will call her by the name she introduced herself to me with at our first meeting, which was with a handshake firm enough to make a point, was a woman who had strong opinions about how other people should live. She had been widowed young, raised Colin alone, and wore that fact like a credential. She was not unkind in the obvious ways. She did not raise her voice. She used very precise language and impeccable manners to say things that left marks. The first time I met her was at a birthday dinner Colin organized for my daughter at a restaurant in Oakville. Italian place, white tablecloths, The kind of menu where you spend $20 on pasta and feel grateful for it. I arrived, and she was already seated, and she greeted me warmly enough, told me she had heard so much about me, asked about my years in social work with what seemed like genuine interest. Then, midway through the appetizers, my daughter mentioned something about a project she was leading, a grant proposal for a wetland corridor south of the city. Something she had been building toward for 2 years. She was excited. She spoke quickly, the way she used to when she was proud of something. Colin's mother smiled and said, "That sounds like a lot of work for something that may not go anywhere. But it's wonderful that you have passion projects." Passion projects. My daughter's face changed. Just for a second. Then she smiled and said, "Yes, well, we'll see." Colin said nothing. I looked at him across the table, and he was refilling his wine glass with the careful attention of someone who has decided not to be present. I filed that away. Over the following months, I began to collect moments the way I used to collect case notes, quietly, without conclusion. Just observation. My daughter stopped bringing up her work around Colin. I noticed it one evening when I visited their apartment for the first time. A very clean, very orderly place in a building near Dundas Street, the kind of building with a concierge and a gym on the second floor, and a personality that belonged entirely to Colin. Her wetland maps were not on the walls. Her collection of bird identification guides was on a shelf in what seemed to be a spare room. The kitchen smelled like the specific cleaning product Colin preferred. She mentioned it twice, unprompted, as if the information were important. She had started jogging in the morning, she told me. Colin thought it was important for her to build better routines. She had cut back on red wine, she said. Colin had read something about inflammation. She was thinking of changing her hair, she mentioned once. Just something a little more polished. I asked her if she was happy. She looked at me with an expression I recognized from my years of work. It was not the face of someone who is happy. It was the face of someone who has been answering that question for so long, with the same word that the word has lost its meaning. She said, "Of course I'm happy, Mum." The dinner happened on a Saturday in February, about 18 months after they moved in together. It was a family dinner at Colin's mother's house in Oakville, a large, well-maintained house on a quiet street with mature trees and the particular silence of a neighborhood that has been expensive for a long time. My daughter had asked me to come. She had been asking me to attend these dinners for months, and I had declined twice before. This time, something in her voice when she asked me made me say yes. There were 6 of us at the table. Colin, my daughter, Colin's mother, a cousin of Colin's whose name I have already forgotten, the cousin's wife, and me. The table was set beautifully. There was a roast, root vegetables, good bread from a bakery in Oakville. Colin's mother had made everything herself and made sure we knew it. My daughter had brought a salad. She had made it herself. Something with roasted beets and goat cheese and walnuts, a recipe she had loved for years. She set it on the table with the quiet hope of someone offering something they care about. Colin's mother looked at it and said, "Oh, you brought a salad." A pause. "Colin doesn't eat goat cheese, sweetheart. I thought you knew that." My daughter said she was sorry. She had forgotten. Colin said nothing. I watched my daughter's hands in her lap. She had pressed them together under the table. The dinner proceeded. I watched. The cousin told a long story about a real estate deal. Colin's mother asked my daughter twice whether she had reconsidered the idea of postponing the grant project. She'd heard it was quite demanding, and whether that was really the best use of her energy right now. My daughter said she was managing fine. Colin's mother smiled and said, "Of course you are." Then, about halfway through the main course, my daughter said something. I no longer remember what it was exactly. Something small, A gentle disagreement about something the cousin had said, a correction of a minor fact. Her voice was quiet but clear. For just a moment, she sounded like herself. Colin set down his fork. He looked at her across the table, and then, in front of all of us, he reached over and he struck her. Not a slap. A sharp, open-handed blow to her upper arm, hard enough that she flinched sideways and her fork hit the edge of her plate with a sound I will never unhear. The table went silent. Colin's mother looked at my daughter with an expression that was almost satisfied. And then she said, clearly in her precise way, "Well, you know how he feels about being contradicted in company." I did not raise my voice. I have spent my entire career learning not to raise my voice at the moments when every instinct tells you to. I set my napkin on the table. I picked up my phone. I called my daughter's name, and I said, in the same tone I used for 34 years in the hardest rooms of my career, "Get your coat." She looked at me. Something moved across her face. It was the first honest thing I had seen on her face in a very long time. Colin said, "She's fine. This is a family dinner." I said, "Yes, and she's my family." I did not look at him when I said it. My daughter stood up. Colin's mother began to say something about overreaction, about not making a scene. I did not respond to her. I walked to the front door, helped my daughter into her coat, and we left. We sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes without speaking. The street was very quiet. There was snow on the ground, the particular flat, blue-gray light of a February night in southern Ontario. My daughter said it was just, "He doesn't like being embarrassed." I said, "I know." She said, "It's not usually like that." I said very gently, "Tell me what it's usually like." She was quiet for a long time, and then she started talking. She talked for almost an hour, about the first time he had grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise, 6 months in, and how he had cried afterward and told her he was terrified of losing her, about the way he monitored her spending. They had a joint account for shared expenses, and he reviewed it weekly and left notes about what she had bought, about how he had asked her, twice, to block a friend from university on her phone because the friend was, he said, a negative influence, about the mornings when she woke up and lay very still for a moment, trying to predict what kind of day it was going to be. I held her hand, and I listened. I did not cry. There would be time for that later. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a colleague I had known for many years, a woman who had spent her career in family crisis services in Hamilton. I described the situation. She walked me through the options, the specific legal supports available in Ontario, the process for a peace bond, what documentation would be useful, which organizations could help my daughter access counseling and transition support without feeling like she was navigating a system alone. My colleague was patient and thorough and did not once suggest that the situation might not be as serious as it sounded. The second call I made was to a family lawyer I had encountered through my work years before. A quiet, careful man who knew what he was doing. I explained the situation and asked what my daughter's options were. He told me. Clearly and without alarm, he told me about what protection orders could accomplish, about the process, about how to document what had already happened. He told me she had choices. I went to my daughter's apartment that afternoon. Colin was at work, and I sat with her at her kitchen table, the one she had picked out herself years ago at a second-hand shop on Ottawa Street, the one with the small burn mark on one corner from a candle. I put a cup of tea in front of her, and I told her what I had learned. I did not tell her what to do. I told her what was possible. She asked me if I thought she had wasted 2 years of her life. I told her that was not the right question. She asked what the right question was. I said the right question was what she wanted her life to look like in 2 years from now. She sat with that for a long time. What followed was not simple or clean. These things never are, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not been through them. There were weeks when my daughter wavered. There were evenings when Colin called her and used the voice. The soft, ruined voice that she had described to me, the one full of remorse and need. And she would call me afterward, shaking, not sure what was real. I did not tell her what was real. I did not tell her what to feel. I stayed close. I kept showing up. I drove to Hamilton every few days. I learned what food she was eating and made sure there was enough of it. I sat with her on the couch and watched the British baking show she loved and did not talk about Colin unless she brought him up first. She spoke to a counselor through a service my colleague had connected us with, a woman who worked specifically with survivors of coercive control, which is what my daughter's situation was called, I learned, when you put the whole picture together. Not just the one evening at the dinner table, the financial monitoring, the social isolation, the slow, patient dismantling of a person's confidence until they stop trusting their own memory of who they were. My daughter filed for a peace bond in the spring. She had documentation, the bruised wrist, photographed at the time by a friend she had confided in, the one Colin had wanted her to block. The bank records from the joint account, a journal she had started keeping 8 months earlier, she told me, because she had begun to feel like she was going crazy and needed somewhere to write down what was actually happening, so she could check it later and know she had not invented it. The journal was the thing that broke my heart the most, not the blow at the dinner table. The journal, the fact that my daughter had needed to write things down to reassure herself that she was sane. Colin contested the peace bond. His mother wrote a letter. The lawyer dealt with both. The conditions were granted. I did not celebrate. There is nothing to celebrate when your child's safety requires a court order. But I sat in my car outside the courthouse on a Tuesday morning in April, the kind of day in Ontario when you can almost believe winter is actually finished. And I let myself cry, really cry, the kind you hold back for months because someone has to stay functional, and you have decided that person is going to be you. That was the day I let it go. My daughter moved into a small apartment in the west end of Hamilton. She found it herself. She painted the walls herself, a pale sage green that she had chosen from the hardware store on her own, without asking anyone. She put her wetland maps back on the walls. She got her bird books out of storage. The grant proposal was approved in June. She called me when she found out, and she laughed the way she used to laugh. Loud, unguarded, taking up the whole room, even through the phone. I stood in my kitchen in my socks, and I laughed with her. She runs in the mornings now, not because someone told her to build better routines. She runs because she wants to before work, along the trail beside the creek near her building, where she has started noticing the birds. She called me last week to tell me she had seen a belted kingfisher for the first time in years. She was so pleased she nearly tripped on the path. I have been a social worker for 34 years. I have seen what abuse does to a person when no one intervenes. I have also seen what happens when someone does, when one person decides that staying quiet is no longer an option they are willing to choose. I was not able to do the hardest part for my daughter. She had to do that herself. But I was able to stay. I was able to know who to call. I was able to sit at a dinner table in Oakville on a February night and say clearly and without hesitation, "Get your coat." If you are watching this, and you are the person at the dinner table with their hands pressed together in their lap, please say something to someone, not because it's easy, because the version of you that existed before knew exactly how to laugh, and that person is still in there, and she deserves to come back. And if you are the mother or the friend or the sister, stay close. Keep showing up. Learn who to call. That is all it takes sometimes, just knowing who to call. I think about the journal a lot, not the dinner table. not the sound of the fork hitting the plate, the journal, the fact that my daughter had started writing things down, quietly, privately, in a notebook she kept because she needed proof that her own memory could be trusted. That is the thing I come back to. That is the thing that tells me how far it had gone before I understood what I was looking at. What happened to her did not begin with a blow. It began much earlier in small erosions, a word chosen carefully to diminish, a preference imposed and then normalized, a version of love that asked her to become smaller, quieter, less certain of herself, until the woman who used to argue with me about composting and transit policy was sitting across from me ordering herbal tea and apologizing for a salad. I have spent a long time thinking about how that happens, and I think it happens because the person doing it is not monstrous in obvious ways. Colin was charming and attentive and said the right things at the right moments. His mother was gracious and precise and never raised her voice. The harm they caused was patient, methodical. It dressed itself up as love and standards and concern, and by the time you recognized it for what it was, the damage was already deep. What I know, from my years of work and from watching my own daughter, is that this kind of situation does not resolve itself. It does not improve with time or with more compromise or with hoping that the person will eventually choose to be better. It requires someone to see it clearly and to act, not out of anger, out of clarity. My daughter had to find her own courage, and she did. The text something I can only describe as a kind of moral backbone that she had always had, but had been slowly talked out of trusting. The moment she stood up at that table and walked to the door with me, that was not weakness giving way. That was her remembering who she was. The courage without direction is very hard to sustain. What helped her, I think, was having information, knowing what her options actually were, knowing that the law in Ontario had specific language for what had been done to her. November, the text death, that heartbreaking, practical, quietly heroic journal, was documentation. Knowledge turned her fear into something she could navigate. She stopped feeling like she was going crazy and started understanding the situation precisely for what it was. And then she kept going, month after month, through the moments when she wavered, through the calls she received that shook her, through the legal process that was slow and impersonal, and nothing like what she deserved. She kept going anyway. That persistence, the decision to get up the next morning and run along the trail and notice the kingfisher and submit the grant proposal and paint the walls sage green. That is not a small thing. That is everything. I set my napkin down at that table in Oakville because 34 years of work had taught me that the most important thing you can do in a room where harm is happening is refuse to pretend it isn't. I hope that wherever you are watching this from, you have someone in your life who will set down their napkin for you. And if you don't, I hope this story reminds you that you are allowed to do it for yourself.